Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Galick and me, Israel Smith. Our last episode ends with armed Mokenians keeping watch over the town and each passing train. As the Chicagoans head back to the city, the reports of wounded and casualties begin to come in. This episode discusses the aftermath of the riot, tells some of the stories of the wounded, and shares the varying media reports from the day, as the riot was covered by 5 different newspapers. A quote from episode 1 sums it up well. By 1864, America was in the midst of vast bloodshed and tragedy, the intensity of which the land had not seen before or since. Although far removed from the lines of war, the most violent period of our nation's history begat one of the most terrible events in Mokena's history. Enjoy part 2 of the Mokena Riot of 1864.
As the smoke and dust settled, both in a literal sense for Mokena and psychologically for those who instigated the riot, a dour assessment of the casualties began. As far as history can tell, no Mokenians were fatally hurt in the affray. The brunt of the casualties were borne by the Chicagoans. Due to the chaos of the event itself, and the urgency with which the injured were whisked to their city homes, any definite number of the casualties inflicted in Mokena could never be established. Media accounts range from vague descriptions of chest and side wounds suffered by unnamed victims to the graphically detailed narratives of those whose injuries read like a battlefield report. One Farnham S. White, a barkeep at a hostelry called the House of David on Dearborn Street, was named as having been shot in the right side of the head, the projectile having fractured his skull just above the ear. He was not expected to survive the grievous wound. Interestingly, White was noted as having been seated in a passenger coach that had been stalled on the siding when he was wounded by a stray ball. Injured in the same manner was one Nicholas Geary, who was severely wounded in the right arm while sitting with a young lady, as well as Billy Pinkerton, who was hit in the hand by possibly the same ball that struck Geary. A man known only by the name of Kelly was said to have taken a ball in the shoulder. An unknown gentleman was shot either in the leg or groin. Surgery was performed on him the same night at his home on Michigan and Market Streets. Perhaps the case of Michael Casey was the most unique of the whole affair, namely in that it is rich with detail. A 24-year-old single man, Casey was mortally shot through the side in Mokena, the lead ball having punctured his liver. Listed by at least one newspaper as part of the gang that left the train to fight, Casey lingered in agony for 2 days before eventually dying, between 7 and 8 o'clock on the morning of August 16th. Employed by the Illinois Central Railroad as a machinist, Michael Casey lived in the boarding house he died in at 162 Van Buren Street. He left behind 2 sisters. After his death, the Cook County coroner held an inquest over his remains, but in the words of a contemporary journalist, very little evidence concerning the affray in Mokena was elicited. What was certain is that in most circles, no sympathy was felt for any of the hurt. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune, who was careful to precede his statement with, "If the information we received was correct," wrote that the assailants were properly punished. As far as can be told, the rich historical narrative of the events in Mokena that summer night is completely true, and no fiction or embellishing has been added to this telling of the riot and its aftermath. It was reconstructed as coherently as possible amidst a confused tangle of contemporary reports, accounts that at times were vastly contradicting. The majority of current knowledge of this calamitous event comes from media contemporary to the incident, and this is perhaps the most interesting aspect of all. Attesting to the brutality of the fight, the riot was covered in at least 5 different newspapers, those being namely the Joliet Signal, the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Evening Journal, the Chicago Times, and a German-language publication called the Illinois Stadtzeitung. Each of their reports, in some cases carried over the space of 2 days, are in disagreement with those of their fellow journalists. Everything from the exact number of rioters, whether or not they came armed, even the approximate number of casualties is extremely clouded. What is clear, however, is that each newspaper, in the style of the day, made no effort to hide which party had won their respective sympathies. The Chicago Tribune distinguished itself with providing the most detailed and relatively objective reporting on the entire affray. Although he perhaps overestimated the total number of pleasure seekers that left Chicago the morning of August 15th with 4,000, the reporter did reckon with 8 to 20 casualties that night, perhaps 3 of which had been mortally wounded. He was of the opinion that the attack on Cheek's Inn, referred to incorrectly as the Northwestern House, was surely premeditated, as large stones were allegedly bought from New Lenox for the direct purpose of causing mayhem in Mokena. The writer mentioned a grim rumor that had reached the city stating that John Cheek had been lynched by the mob, but staying true to the facts gave it no credence in his columns. The Tribune included a slight anti-Irish slant to their coverage, not only highlighting the drunkenness of the crowd, but also adding that the destruction of Cheek's property was, in the matter of the countrymen, of those who began the ruin of the Western Hotel. While the Chicago Evening Journal carried much of the same information that the Tribune did, its reporting placed special emphasis on the difficulty of attaining reliable witness accounts. Their source placed the number of wounded at anywhere from 10 to 30, but led the reader to believe that this number exclusively referred to those wounded by stray rounds landing amongst the train coaches. The writer at the Evening Journal stated that many persons say there were 5 or 6 killed in the melee, while others insist there were none. A rumor was acknowledged that 2 or 3 of the attackers were killed outright and hastily left on the ground in Mokena where they fell. Their columnist noted that the whole affair was brutal and reprehensible on both sides. As of a day after the riot, no one in Chicago had been arrested for the clash, and those at the Evening Journal hoped that none of the guilty would escape without being punished. In the pages of the Joliet Signal, one of Will County's premier newspapers, a staunch defense of Cheek and his actions was to be found. The identity of the Signal's correspondent has been lost to time, but he presented a very pro-Mokena stance to his readers. Without question, he stated that the episode was the most fearful riot that has ever occurred in this county and resulted from the excessive use of ardent spirits, and insisted that the Chicagoans were already gregariously drunk and inclined to violence upon their arrival in Mokena. The last paragraph of the Signal's reportage is a defensive editorial, coming to the guard of the shaken John Cheek. Readers were told not to place the blame for the chaotic night on Cheek, who as an established resident of Mokena was always recognized as a quiet, peaceable man who attends to his own affairs. The Chicago Times presented the grisly fight in the larger context of the raging Civil War. Headlining their column, A Carnival of Blood, scenes of the war were drummed into readers' minds with phrases like, "Brothers are sheathing bayonets and hurling bullets into brothers' hearts," and "The bloody infection of war is growing with fearful rapidity." It is easy to infer that the Times was blaming the war with a concurrent wave of crime that had Chicago in its grip, ultimately stating, "For what does one life amount to when thousands are being killed in every battle?" As the Times' coverage of the riot began, a distinct tone in the writing of their correspondent crept to the surface. He exploited the opportunity to address his readers in a haughty tone as if from a metaphorical high horse, and spared no detail in penning a very inflammatory and ultimately anti-Mokena piece. According to the account of the unknown journalist in question, John Cheek greeted the excursionists at gunpoint when they entered his place and ordered them to leave the premises or suffer the consequences. A violent outburst then ensued in the derisively named Grog Shop, the cause of which, in the face of the overwhelmingly disagreeing historical record, was allegedly not known to the travelers. From the perspective of this writer, Cheek and his acquaintances, who were called infuriated wretches, also pointedly opened fire on women and children who were near open doors in the railroad coaches. Once again, this account is not mentioned in any other period sources. Any account of that horrible day would be remiss not to acknowledge the extensive coverage of the Chicago-based German-language Illinois Staatszeitung, Of all the publications surveyed, none was more vocal about the events that August day. The Staatszeitung provides a unique, you-are-there look into the violence that day, as its reportage contained detailed correspondence from two of the Mokenians who felt the wrath of the whiskey-soused Irish rowdies, Conrad Stoll and Moritz Weiss. First and foremost, pharmacist Weiss wanted to set the record straight on the condition the excursionists were in when they steamed into town. In a letter to the editor penned in his mother tongue, he wrote, "Allow a witness to report the truth to your honored sheet." While the Chicago paper had managed to send a reporter to Mokena, Weiss noted that he was only able to report over a short time in a skin-deep way. He communicated to the paper that the excursionists of the St. Vincent de Paul Society were the cause of 3 fights at Cold Spring Grove, after which the cowards trampled down 10 acres of corn like a herd of swine, after which they split up lots of schnapps between themselves and took the train to Mokena in a properly tanked up condition. Moritz Weiss confidently declared that none of the gunfire emanating from the Mokenians hit the railroad cars, and in closing demanded that a proper investigation take place in the matter. Mokena storekeeper Conrad Stoll praised the Staatszeitung's coverage of the drunken riot, but modestly added that they still didn't know the tenth of what happened. After submitting his richly detailed account of the day in German words, he pleaded to the editor to please be so good to put all of this in the paper so that law-abiding people can see what a band of rogues this was. He also wished for the perpetrators to be brought to justice and for them to be made responsible monetarily for the damage that was inflicted upon Mokena that day.
So 5 different newspapers covered the fight, this brawl in Mokena. Like with anything, I guess there's some bias in the story. And any idea where that comes from? I mean, why would the Chicago paper have a bias?
I don't know, really. If anything, I've always thought maybe it was kind of like Chicago was a big city looking down upon the tiny little railroad/farm town that Mokena was at the time. Although the other Chicago papers were nice to Mokena. So it wasn't, the Chicago papers across the board. It was just that one Chicago paper that was very unfriendly towards Mokenians.
Which one of these probably is the most close to what really happened?
I would say, if I really had to guess, I would put it at the German paper, the Staatszeitung, because they were corresponding with 2 Mokenians who were there and were victims of this whole thing. So they had the eyewitnesses right there at their disposal. I would also, I would say the Joliet Signal was, if I had to bet, was probably a pretty grounded one. Just because they were from Will County too, and were familiar with Mokena, and they had people here in town who were their subscribers, and the things like that, being familiar with the town and so on and so forth.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. It is. It's very interesting stuff, especially to see how the media of the time handled the whole thing.
Yeah, and I like the line, they said they took the train to Mokena in a properly tanked up condition.
Yeah, that's what he wrote. It was, translated, of course, but that's what he said. Yeah, Conrad Stoll wanted it made abundantly clear what kind of shape these people were in when they got to town.
Yeah, that's a definition right there.
In the end, it remains unknown if any of the parties involved in the melee were ever prosecuted. The matter is further complicated by the fact that legal records of any sort pertaining to the Cook County participants would have been destroyed in the Chicago fire of 1871. As bitter as this truth is, the fact must be accepted that this portion of the fearsome night's aftermath will forever remain unknown to modern Will County. The grisly summer in Mokena and its blood harvest were quickly forgotten to the tides of time. Another ethnically charged incident in town during the 1890s, albeit one with no fatalities, sparked a flicker of remembrance by some locals, who in turn retold slightly distorted recollections to a Joliet reporter. Aside from the contemporary news accounts of the 1864 riot, it was never again mentioned in the known printed record. Past county and local histories gloss over the event, possibly in shame, but more likely in unawareness. Descendants of longtime founding Mokena families recall no details of it having been passed down through the generations. The fates of those Chicagoans who left the cars in Mokena that night remain unknown. Of the few identities that have surfaced from the fog of decades, those have proved unusually difficult to trace. Of those injured that weren't already listed as having died, it can't help but be pondered if some lived for decades afterward carrying pistol balls in their limbs and extremities, telling tales of mayhem in a small town no one had ever heard of. In a rather lucky turn, history has been generous in recording the life of John Sheik after the ghastly fight. In the post-Civil War era, he seems to have turned his focus to farming. In an 1873 plat map of Frankfort Township, Sheik's name flows across a large portion of the township's northwest. Included in this substantial acreage were 2 farms. Ostensibly, one could have served as Sheik's main residence, while the other would possibly have been under the care of a family member or a leasee. Until relatively recently, one of these farms, having been situated on Wolf Road, approximately 460 yards north of today's 191st Street, boasted a commodious farmhouse built in the Italianate style, contemporaneous with the area in which Sheik would have owned the property. Of the other farm, located on the north side of 191st Street at what is now Schoolhouse Road, no trace remains. Upon leaving the ownership of the Sheik family in the early 20th century, modern construction was carried out on this estate. As years progressed, John Sheik became very involved in Mokena's affairs. In the spring of 1887, he received a seat on the Mokena Village Board, taking part in the decision-making that marked the first few years of the village's incorporation. Not long thereafter, John Sheik found himself in the sunset of his life. As he became ill, his mind surely wandered to thoughts of better days, and perhaps also to a day of horror, the wanton destruction and gore at his hotel on August 15, 1864. Sheik passed away in Mokena the night of February 25, 1890, to a deadly combination of kidney inflammation and influenza. No sooner than Sheik's family and friends laid his earthly remains to rest at St. John's Cemetery, amid a sea of obelisks etched with flowing Germanic script, had his comrades from the village board honored him with a special resolution. Passing sympathy to the Sheik family, the resolution read, in part, "We mourn for one who was in every way worthy of our respect and highest regards." At the epicenter of this entire account stands Sheik's Western Hotel, the site of the fatal riot. Over a century and a half after that night, the question begs itself of where exactly the inn stood in Mokena. In poring over period property records, little solid information can be extracted. In an interesting footnote to history, a mysterious incident in 1875 could potentially shed light on the mystery. Although the period in question was one in which John Sheik considered himself a farmer, he still retained ownership on a building in Mokena. In November of the aforementioned year, a disastrous fire ravaged the property, destroying it. The wooden structure was devoid of inhabitants, and, interestingly, the fire was quickly deemed the work of an arsonist. A rumor even spread in the area that the stench of an acrid kerosene accelerant could be smelled for a 2-block radius. Could this have been the site of the riot 11 years previous? At this late point, it's impossible to know. Too few details have survived the decades to hazard a guess. So it was that on a summer evening during our Great Civil War, a booze-soaked horde of troublemakers from the city came to our town looking for trouble. They found it in this little-known, yet significant event in the early history of Mokena. This incident, in all its wretchedness, deserves to be remembered as a major part of our narrative.
So again, kind of like in context of the time, we mentioned this is before the Great Chicago Fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The Civil War is going on, major event.
Yeah.
When you look up the major events of these years, like everything is Civil War related.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And, 8 to 20 casualties.
Yeah.
None of which were Mokenians.
Right. Yeah.
And it's totally forgotten.
It is. It's crazy. That's such a horrible thing happened. But yeah, it was
And
Yeah.
so the question is kind of put there, and maybe that's why it did. Looking back now, did they overreact? I mean, does it look like they were probably justified still?
Yeah, it's hard to say. In my opinion, if I try to place, first of all, looking at the accounts of what happened and trying to kind of separate, it's like, okay, well, this one is very anti-Mokena. We shouldn't place too much credence in this one. And well, here's this one from the Joliet and the German paper, et cetera, et cetera. If you come up with a narrative that you can kind of accept, then I put myself in John Sheik's shoes. I think I probably would have done the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he is trying to run his business. All these people in a pretty nasty shape storm into his place, start causing trouble. They want more. He says, no, you got to pay first for what you already had. And then they start tearing apart his building. I can see myself being him and running to grab my gun, at least to scare them.
And the context of the time. I mean, that's the one thing we can never truly understand.
Yeah, exactly.
1864 Mokena is not 2023 Mokena.
No,
this is on the edge of the Wild West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
So,
yeah, it was.
They were defending their lives. I mean,
pretty much.
And their properties. I mean, I think his Sheik's property was the line. It said it was erased from the cityscape or from the streetscape of Front Street Mokena. I mean, that's amazing. Like they basically just down to the ground destroyed this building.
Yeah, it was very serious. It is hard to put yourself there. I can't imagine anything. I can't imagine putting myself in anything from 1864. Let alone something as horrible as this.
I mean, the closest, you see of when we've seen different times in the news of current times of riots and business owners and that defending themselves. But even in those cases, at some place, there's a police presence coming. These guys, there was nobody except for their neighbors, their friends, and their families. And their young kids are being beaten.
Yeah.
It's amazing to think that happened here in our downtown.
It is. It really is. Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah. Maybe
someday, one day, somebody will make this into a movie or something.
Yeah, right. I know. I think it's worthy of one.
Seems worthy of it.
Yeah,
sure.
No, definitely.
It's a really interesting story.
It is,
and, again, almost hard to believe that's true that it happened here.
Right.
But, it is a significant, one of the significant events that's happened in our village, for sure.
It really is. Yeah, it really is. Yeah. It deserves to be. It wasn't pretty, but history sometimes isn't. And it's part of our narrative. And I think, therefore, that people should remember it and know about it.
And hey, man, I mean, we defended our property, right?
Yeah.
We defended our downtown.
Yeah, exactly. I think, if anything, the Mokenians came out as the victors that day.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, they say about that farm strength,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
These guys are farmers. They defended themselves. I mean, they took their whoopings too, it looks like.
Yeah,
but,
right. Yeah.
No, just an amazing story, an amazing piece of true history from town. And I'm glad we could include it here, and you wrote it very well.
Oh, thank you.
As always, we'll include the link in our show notes to the blog. So if you want to read those as well. And Matt, anything else you want to add about this story before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I can throw in one more little tidbit. So John Sheik, during the Civil War and at the end of the 1850s, he had his the Western Hotel, his inn where all this transpired. There is still a tangible piece of him in town, as those of us who listened to our very first episode or read the article on my blog. History pretty much points us in the direction of John Sheik having, of course, after this, having built the building where Little Al's is nowadays. Yeah, because that was John Sheik's Brick Hotel was what was referred to around town about 10 or so years later. So it looks like, he got back into the business a little while afterwards, and he was the one who probably built that building.
Wow.
And his son, Charles, also ran a saloon there later on. So, yeah, so that's...
He left his lasting fingerprint on Front Street still.
Yeah, so you can still see his work in town today. Something still left from him.
Very cool. Along with... like we said, there's still some Chic family in town here.
Oh, yeah, they're around. Yeah.
Pretty cool, too.
It is, yeah.
Well, Matt, thank you again for sharing this story.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed part 2 of the Mokena Riots of 1864. This is a really interesting story. We really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you all for the positive reviews, for listening, of course, for sharing sharing the show with your friends. It means a lot that people are sharing our show and enjoying the stories that we're sharing with you all. So please keep that up. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Google Mokena's Front Porch. You'll find our page with all the episodes on it as well as a beautiful picture of the Yunker farm. Also, you can email us at mokenasfrontporch@gmail.com. If you have any ideas, thoughts for a show, or anything like that, feel free to email us. Again, that's mokenasfrontporch@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on Mokena's Front Porch.